He said, man, that sure is some good-looking stagecoach. That's what they call a motorhome.
Hollywood has always been a place where legends are made, but it is also a place where grudges are born, where egos collide, and where the most carefully constructed public images can shatter behind closed doors. For decades, Ernest Borgnine was known as one of the most likable, warm-hearted men in the entire entertainment industry. He was the kind of actor who remembered every crew member's name, who showed up early and stayed late, and who never once treated anyone on set as beneath him. Directors loved him. Co-stars adored him. Audiences trusted him. And yet, beneath that enormous, gap-toed smile and those kind, crinkled eyes, there was one chapter of his long career that he could never quite close. One name that, even in his final years, could still tighten his jaw and cloud his expression. One co-star who pushed him so far beyond his limits that forgiveness, that virtue he so freely extended to nearly everyone else in his life, simply never came. To understand why that unresolved tension mattered so deeply to a man like Ernest Borgnine, you first have to understand who he actually was, not the Oscar winner, not the television icon, but the human being underneath all of it. Born Ernest Borgnine in 1917 in Hamden, Connecticut, he came into the world as the son of Italian immigrants who had crossed an ocean in search of something better. His early childhood was shaped by upheaval. When he was barely 2 years old, his parents separated and his mother took him to Italy, to the small town of Carpi near Modena, where he spent the next 5 years absorbing Italian culture and speaking nothing but Italian. Then in 1923, his parents reconciled and the family returned to America, where his father Americanized the family name from Borgnine to Borgnine in an effort to blend in. These early years of displacement and reinvention gave young Ernest a quality that would define him for the rest of his life, an extraordinary capacity to adapt, to absorb new environments, and to find his footing even when the ground was shifting beneath him. He had no childhood dream of becoming an actor. Growing up in New Haven, Connecticut, he was drawn to sports and physical activity, not to the theater. There was nothing in his early years to suggest he would one day stand on a stage in front of thousands of people, let alone collect one of the most coveted awards in the history of cinema. His path to Hollywood was indirect, accidental, and thoroughly improbable. It began with the United States Navy, where he enlisted in 1935 right out of high school and served for 6 years aboard the USS Lamberton. He received an honorable discharge in 1941, but just 2 months later, Pearl Harbor changed everything. He re-enlisted in January 1942, this time serving on the USS Sylph, a patrol yacht protecting the Atlantic coast. By the time the war ended and he was discharged in 1945, he had risen to the rank of gunner's mate first class and earned a collection of military honors that he carried with quiet pride for the rest of his life. It was his mother who nudged him toward acting. She told him he had a forceful personality and that he ought to try it. That simple observation from a woman whose opinion he trusted completely was enough to set him on an entirely new course. He enrolled in the Randall School of Drama in Hartford and eventually made his way to the Barter Theater in Virginia, where actors were sometimes paid in vegetables rather than money because the theater had been founded during the Great Depression on the principle that food could substitute for admission. Borgnine didn't care. He painted sets, fixed costumes, chased a live chicken across the stage one memorable night when the bird escaped into the audience, and did whatever was asked of him. He absorbed everything. He learned to improvise. He learned to connect with a live audience. He learned that the gap between disaster and entertainment could be bridged by sheer commitment. By 1949 he was on Broadway, appearing in Harvey alongside James Stewart, a man he studied with such intensity that he kept a notebook of observations about how Stewart delivered his lines. The play ran for over 1,700 performances, giving Borgnine a foundation of discipline and craft that no film school could have provided. Television came calling in 1951, and Columbia Pictures followed shortly after, offering him a small part that was nonetheless a foot in the door. Then came From Here to Eternity in 1953, the film that announced to Hollywood that this thick-necked, broad-faced man with the unlikely smile was capable of something genuinely frightening. His portrayal of the sadistic Sergeant Fatso Judson, a character who beats Frank Sinatra's Angelo Maggio to death with a nightstick, was so convincing and so deeply inhabited that crew members avoided him between takes and Sinatra refused to speak to him off-camera for weeks. Borgnine later admitted that the role gave him nightmares for months afterward and that some audience members, unable to separate the actor from the character, sent him actual death threats. 2 years later he did the impossible. He played Marty, a gentle, lonely Bronx butcher looking for love in a low-budget film that nobody expected to matter. The movie cost $343,000 to make and went on to win Best Picture. Borgnine himself won the Academy Award for Best Actor at 38 years old, beating out James Dean and Spencer Tracy in the process. His acceptance speech was brief and heartfelt. He thanked his mother. It was exactly the kind of moment that defined him, modest, genuine, and rooted in gratitude rather than ego. Director Delbert Mann later said that Borgnine didn't act Marty. He simply was Marty. That observation captured something essential about the man. He didn't perform emotions. He felt them. And that sincerity, that complete absence of pretension, was what made him so beloved by nearly everyone who worked with him. Nearly everyone. Because there are exceptions to every rule, and in the long and varied life of Ernest Borgnine, the exception had a name, and that name was Joan Crawford. When Borgnine signed on to appear in Johnny Guitar in 1954, he was still a relatively fresh face in Hollywood, a man building momentum and eager to prove himself in every project he took on. The film was a western, set in the Arizona desert, directed by Nicholas Ray, and it featured a cast that on paper seemed to promise something bold and interesting. What it actually delivered, behind the scenes at least, was one of the most toxic and destabilizing working environments that anyone associated with the production would ever experience. And at the center of that toxicity, generating it with a consistency and an intensity that left witnesses genuinely shaken, was Joan Crawford. Crawford was at a complicated point in her career in 1954. She was still a major star, still a name that opened doors and commanded attention, but the golden era of her dominance was behind her and she knew it. Whatever insecurities that knowledge stirred in her were not something she processed quietly or privately. They manifested outwardly, explosively, and with a particular ferocity that she directed at her co-star Mercedes McCambridge, the woman cast alongside her in Johnny Guitar. The animosity between Crawford and McCambridge was not simply professional rivalry. It was personal in a way that contaminated every corner of the production. Crawford had discovered that McCambridge's husband, Fletcher Markle, had once been romantically involved with her, and that piece of history was all the justification she apparently needed to make McCambridge's professional life a sustained nightmare. Borgnine watched all of it from the uncomfortable vantage point of a man who wanted nothing more than to do his job well and go home. He was not the target of Crawford's wrath, and she was in fact perfectly civil to him on most occasions, even warm in her better moments. But what he witnessed being done to others around him was something that he could not dismiss or compartmentalize, no matter how hard he tried. He watched Crawford storm onto the set one afternoon, locate McCambridge's costumes, and throw them out onto the Arizona highway with a contemptuous fury that left the crew scrambling to retrieve them before they were scattered beyond recovery by passing traffic. He watched the two women refuse to occupy the same physical space, which forced director Nicholas Ray into the creative and logistical nightmare of filming their scenes separately and then stitching the results together in editing. He watched the tension on that set escalate day after day with no relief in sight. Then came September 3rd, the day things finally boiled over completely. Crawford and McCambridge, who had been circling each other with barely suppressed hostility throughout the shoot, lost whatever restraint they had been maintaining. What began as an argument became something physical. They were swinging at each other. It was Borgnine and co-star Sterling Hayden who stepped in and physically separated them, pulling two of Hollywood's most prominent actresses apart on a film set in the middle of the desert. Borgnine would later describe it as the most unprofessional behavior he had ever witnessed in his entire career, and that was a career that spanned more than 6 decades and brought him into contact with some of the most difficult and demanding personalities in the history of the industry. But the moment that truly lodged itself in Borgnine's memory, the one he returned to again and again in interviews and private conversations over the years that followed, was not the physical confrontation between the two women. It was something he saw Crawford do to someone else entirely. A young production assistant, a person with no power and no ability to fight back, made the mistake of being nearby on a day when Crawford's mood was at its most volatile. Crawford, without apparent hesitation, grabbed a cup of hot coffee and threw it at him. The young man suffered second-degree burns. Borgnine was standing close enough to witness the entire thing, and what he saw in that moment was not the complicated, insecure woman he might have been able to find some sympathy for. What he saw was pure cruelty directed at someone who was utterly defenseless, someone who was simply doing their job in a difficult environment and who had done nothing to deserve what happened to them. That was the line for Ernest Borgnine. He was a man who had grown up with very little, who had spent 10 years serving his country in conditions that required him to look out for the people around him, who had come to acting through hard work and humility rather than through privilege or connections. He understood difficulty. He understood pressure. He had enormous patience for the creative anxieties and personal struggles that inevitably surfaced in the intense environment of a film production. But he had no tolerance, none at all, for the abuse of power directed at people who could not defend themselves. And what Joan Crawford did to that young production assistant on the set of Johnny Guitar was precisely that. It was an act of cruelty made possible by the gap in status between them, and Borgnine never found a way to reconcile it with any version of professional respect. He tried to be measured about it in the years that followed. In interviews he would acknowledge Crawford's undeniable talent, her technical precision in front of the camera, the sheer force of her screen presence. He was not a man given to gratuitous condemnation, and he understood that the entertainment industry tended to amplify the worst impulses of people who had spent decades being told that their comfort and their preferences were the only ones that mattered. He even admitted that Crawford had her better moments, that she could be generous and even charming when the mood suited her. On the final day of filming she surprised the entire crew with personalized bottles of Pepsi Cola, a gesture made possible by the fact that her then-husband was the chief executive of the Pepsi Cola company. It was her version of a peace offering, and Borgnine was honest enough to acknowledge it for what it was. But acknowledgement is not forgiveness, and generosity on the last day does not erase what happened on all the other days. Borgnine lived for 95 years, long enough to develop a philosophical perspective on most of the difficult experiences of his life. He found a way to make peace with the marriages that had failed, with the roles he had turned down and later regretted, with the accidents and injuries and professional setbacks that had marked his long journey through one of the most unforgiving industries in the world. He found lasting love in his final decades with his fifth wife Tova, and in the warmth and stability of that relationship he seemed to find a kind of completion that had eluded him for most of his adult life. He remained active and engaged almost until the very end, recording dialogue for SpongeBob SquarePants just 2 weeks before his death in July of 2012.